In this episode, Chuck and Brock talk about a Lutheran theologian from the 19th century, Rudolf Bultmann, from an essay in the book Creative Minds in Contemporary Theology, edited by Professor Philip E Hughes.
All right, my friend, it's a pleasure, it's an honor to be with you today. Thank you for these beautiful discussion sessions. They're so edifying, and there's a challenge in them, a very pleasant theological challenge. I think of reading treatments like these as trying to solve the Rubik's Cube of the history of theology, if that makes any sense. And we're reading together just a few chapters from the Creative Minds in Contemporary Theology work. This is a multiple authors coming together to write a series of essays edited by Professor Philip E Hughes. And so we have contributions from maybe a dozen or so authors writing about a good number of interesting and important minds in the 20th century in theological matters. And this is so important, I think, because growing up in the latter part of the 20th century, many of these figures dominated the landscape, and the talking points that they are best known for were some of the most interesting discussion points in theology at its day, whether for good or for bad. And I'll share with you just bluntly right now, we were talking about being blunt before the start of the discussion period here. I think on balance, probably most of the voices being profiled in this Creative Minds maybe can be considered regression, declension, a downgrade in theology. I think that's an arguable point, but it's certainly my perspective now after trying to crack the Gordian knot of these 20th century thinkers. Now, of course, I think we have to explain why that is. I don't just think, you or I want to sit here and just throw stones at some of these thinkers without having good reason and articulating that and talking through some of those points. And I would say if there was a chief villain in this volume, and villain is a strong word, but I really can't think of a better. If there was a chief villain in this volume, I think it would have to be the subject of today's discussion. So this is chapter 5, Rudolf Bultmann. And so we had a chance to read an essay by Robert D. Knudsen. And Chuck, I'm starting off to sound a very strong negative, and I think people are going to want to wonder why. And so this discussion period, we want to get into that. But sometimes when we're discussing the back and forths associated with various thinkers, sometimes it might lead listeners with the question, what's your final analysis or evaluation? And in some cases, it's very mixed. So some thinkers, very mixed, other thinkers, very positives. For example, last week we talked about C. Berkouwer. And if Bultmann is the stinker, the villain of this volume, I think Berkouwer is one of the strongest and most positive participants in this volume. And so there's some important reasons to talk about Bultmann. And I have, of course, perhaps started from a very dark place, and we'll see where that comes out from that. But I think this chapter in this essay gives us some warrant to really take some care in the analysis, in the consideration of Bultmann and his thought. So without meaning to take away all wiggle room, Chuck, and to want to start things off in this extreme negative disposition, what are your thoughts with Bultmann? What were your thoughts about him maybe before having read this essay? And then maybe how did the essay change you or give you more information to think about some things associated with him? And how would you evaluate him if you're putting him on the slab of your own critical analysis?
Yeah, I would say that prior to our reading of this book, while I'd heard the name Rudolf Bultmann, primarily, I think because of a few references to him in some things that I've read, especially over the years, I would occasionally try to get a little bit of a different perspective when I would read Christian magazines. Christianity Today, which comes more from the evangelical perspective, was one that I would often read, but I would occasionally turn to the Christian Century, which is perhaps on the mainline side, their version of that. And I would see Bultmann's name in there occasionally and a few other places, but I knew very little about Bultmann until we read about him. And in the final analysis for me, what I would say about Bultmann is that he, for me, expresses the danger of relying too heavily on simply a dialectical way of argument and of considering new information. Now, and what I mean by that is this. In the dialectical method, we'll have a dialogue between two poles. And oftentimes that assumption is that you have these two poles. And what people who use the dialectical method do is they try to find a way to take two ideas that are very different from each other, that seem like that they can't be brought together, that they seem like they're at opposite ends of a spectrum, and then just have a dialogue back and forth so that we can find some sort of common ground. Now, I will say that at times that sort of dialectical conversation can be very helpful, because I think it allows us to find areas where there may be common ground. But where it can be very much not helpful, where it can be somewhat dangerous, is where instead of using it as a way to enter into dialogue, enter into discourse, to understand someone who is coming from a different perspective than you and learn from them and find whether sometimes there's a tendency to just use it to come up to an average or come up to some sort of new thing that is neither one nor the other. And when it comes to theology, obviously, that's got to be a concern. And in fact, I think Bultmann actually in theology is an example of a very similar move, and probably from very similar perspectives, as I've been discussing with some friends when it comes to how Christians are involved in the economic world. And this comes actually out of a book that I read by Brian Fickert, who is one of the leaders of an organization that tries to help Christians look into how can we deal with poverty and how can we help people in a way that ministers to them as a whole and not just simply as just homo economicus, for example. And his organization is called the Palmer Center. And Fickert has pointed out in the area of economics and the way we deal with the world, there is this very much coming out of the 19th century German idealism movement, this idea that all that is real is that which we can experience, that we can touch, that we can sense. And so in that system of what Fickert calls Western naturalism, we tend to think of people as merely physical beings, and that's it, that there's no spiritual sense, there's nothing transcendent about them. Even relationships aren't all that important. A human being becomes a materialistic robot whose primary goal is to get as much as they can possibly can and take in everything that they want, and because that's the way that you materially experience happiness. And then he points out that a lot of Christians understand that is not a proper way to look at things. It's a way that really questions whether God even exists. It misses things that we can understand in the world that just don't seem right. This whole idea that we are material things and we can live autonomously as individuals, that there's something that strikes us as not quite right about that, especially as Christians, but even generally, the idea that no man has been out there. But then using this dialectical method, what we do is instead of rejecting outright this way of thinking, we as Christians will oftentimes find a medium whereby we'll take our biblical gospel way of thinking and we'll integrate this Western naturalist way of thinking, and we get something in between, a sort of a syncretism. And Fickert, in his book, Becoming Whole, describes this, he calls it evangelical Gnosticism. And he describes it as this sort of view that is held by too many of us evangelicals today that sort of divides the world into the sacred and the secular. And there is the sacred world where God is in control and there's providence and all that. But in the sort of the secular world, we still all too often just simply accept the tenets of Western naturalism. And we just let Western naturalism run its course in the day-to-day life. And only in the upper register do we acknowledge that God exists and has some level of control. And in economics, what that tends to do is as Christians, we still create ways of trying to help people deal with poverty, that kind of thing, and in a way that Western naturalism would, and doesn't really get at more than just the needs of a physical robot. and then thinks of the future as this time when we'll get to be harp-playing ghosts riding around on clouds, and that's what we're looking forward to in this upper register, where the spiritual is good and we'll leave behind these bodies here on this evil earth. That's a long way to talk about. I think Bultmann makes the same mistake when it comes to theology that Fickert points out that a lot of people make when it comes, and that is this. So Bultmann recognized that sort of this 19th century Kantian revolution really missed something, that the sort of the traditional liberal ways of thinking, they weren't exactly right. He wanted to maintain some level of connection with some of the message of Scripture, whereas German idealists, they just wanted to toss out the baby with the bathwater completely. And so what Bultmann does, though, is in this dialectical manner, he maybe pulls back on some of that, but he looks for things that he might agree with from that liberalism and tries in some way to combine it, to syncretize it with more traditional Christian thinking. But as we know, when we try to mix good and evil, which, again, to put some real stark terms on it and be real blunt about it, that's what he's doing. He's trying to mix good and evil. But when you do that, what wins out? It's kind of like when I used to teach Heidelberg Catechism, and I would try to teach my kids what total depravity was. And I would have a glass of water, and I would say, this is how God created us, pure and blameless. And then I would put an eyedropper of red food coloring in. I'd say, here's sin, our original sin and our actual sins, and it falls into this glass of water, and suddenly the whole glass of water is red or pink or whatever. It affects every single part of it. That's what's happened here. There's the total depravity has happened as a result of allowing some of this spec in of really unchristian ways of thinking. And so what we get, and we'll talk about some of the details of it, what we get with Bultmann then is this whole demythologization process and different things about where maybe he's trying to attack a liberal view of things, and yet his answers don't really give us anything. His answers are there's still so much of that stain in them that we can't recover from it. And in the same way that those of us, as we understand about sin, that without Christ actually coming in and removing that stain from us, that we're so filled with it ourselves, and every part of it is affected by it. So again, yeah, I think I'm being pretty blunt, just as you were about Bultmann, but I feel like that's what happened here, is that he tried to mix the good and the bad, and the result is that he tried to get a little bit of the clear, but allow a little bit of the red in, and pretty soon all you got is a glass of water that's completely pink.
Yeah, thank you for that analogy, Chuck, and for opening it up like that. I think that was balanced. I think it was fair, and yet it's also critical in the way that it needs to be. So describing Bultmann as Knudsen describes him here, and as other sources describe him, we have this very modern conception in Bultmann, embodied in his thinking, of the theologian as a demythologizer. Now, the premise that is new to Bultmann's age and day is that one cannot be a thinking man and believe in the Bible. After all, it's myth. And so modern man can accept, in Bultmann's thinking, the biblical worldview only by a sacrifice of the intellect. And so Bultmann is a 20th century embodiment of one of the largest criticisms to come out of the 19th century secular Enlightenment. And it's this idea that moderns have taken this dialectic step from immaturity to maturity. We used to think something dumb, but now we've grown up, we've come to our senses, progress has made us better people, and now we are free to see things as they really are, as opposed to looking through the lens of that immature way of thinking. And so I think as a Christian, it's worth responding, pushing back. Is it really a dialectical step from an immature position to a mature position, or a more mature position? This modern movement, this modern idea that we cannot believe in the Bible the way the Orthodox thinkers, and I'm going to throw out Luther and Calvin as some preeminent idea makers in this older space. There are others, of course, but we'll see. It's very clear. For example, Karl Barth, who we're going to talk about soon, talks about the theology of Luther and Calvin, but it's not in a commendable fashion. It's having made this dialectical pivot from something less mature. And so as a Christian, I want to respond back and say, did we really get more mature in adopting these presuppositions, these modern ideas? And if so, by what standard are we measuring the increase in maturity in this dialectic step? Now, I think there's an obvious thesis here that comes up. How then can Bultmann claim to associate with Christianity? If the Bible is hopelessly mythological, then why even be a Christian? And I think that's the secular frame from the 19th century. You get into the transition from the older thinkers in the German idealism, Hegel, people in that first 2 or 3 generations who, while they articulated these new ideas, this revolution in ideas, still maintained some semblance of theistic belief, even as they tried to move the foundation out from under it and take this dialectical step. But by the time you get to the 3rd generation or the 4th generation, you have people like the young Hegelians, people like, for example, Karl Marx, who are openly atheistic, and the break has been made. This dialectic step from immaturity of Christian thought to the maturity of modern thought, there's a break. The break has occurred in the thinking of those 19th century thinkers. And now Bultmann is wanting to, in some sense, acknowledge the dialectic pivot, but yet wants to retain some aspect of being Christian. Now, part of how he wishes to do this is he will replace the biblical message as it was confessionally articulated in the confessionalism of the Reformed following Luther and Calvin. Think here of the Reformed confessions of faith. Bultmann is going to reject that, and he's going to instead refer to this idea of the message of the Bible, or the kerygma. And the kerygma represents the truths about Christianity that the church speak or proclaim. Now, we're going to have what to this modest thinker seems slightly two-faced. We're going to see Bultmann studying the scriptures and others. So this is Bultmann and Barth are very associated. This movement is characterized as neo-orthodoxy. And we're going to see that the neo-orthodox wish to positivistically reconstruct Christianity out of the corpse of the old reliance upon the Holy Scriptures in the way that Luther and Calvin and the confessionalists understood. We're going to see this reconstruction of a Christian kerygma, a Christian message that just happens to have also made the same dialectical step. And so Bultmann's demythologizing program is around something called form criticism, in which he puts the Bible in the same category as myth, and from there criticizes it and says the task of the modern theologian is to find the kernel of good truth that still remains within the useless husk of the form of the Bible that has come down to us in the modern period. So this is a statement just trying to describe the landscape of Bultmann's position. What do you think of some of those ideas, Chuck, and where would you branch as you're trying to triangulate around what this might mean and the consequences and implications of it?
Again, there is a sense in which you understand what Bultmann was trying to do and almost sympathize a little bit in that Bultmann recognizes that what liberalism had done in jettisoning a lot of the framework of Scripture and jettisoning a lot of that worldview, in the end, they had basically thrown out everything, right? Even the message. And so you understand that what Bultmann's trying to do is to say, let's not do that. That there is a biblical message that we need to understand, that we need to keep. And okay, that's that in and of itself. If that's all that if that's all that we were left with, we would understand that. We would say, yes, thank you. Thank you, Rudolf. Thank you for wanting to make sure that we maintain that. The problem, of course, is that even in that process of trying to determine that biblical message, the kerygma, that we don't want to jettison. We're allowing so much of the framework that is necessary to a biblical worldview to go away. And if we no longer have that framework upon which to rest that message, suddenly that message can become unmoored. I think that's to some extent what has happened with this idea of demythologization. Is, yeah, okay, we're trying to protect this gospel message, but we've allowed it to become so unmoored because we're still willing to reject so much of what comes as part of scripture and a biblical worldview, that now that key message, that kerygma, becomes unmoored, and when we can't necessarily even trust it anymore because of that. So I think in the end that's where it comes. Now, I do think that there are some interesting things that Bultmann does in some of his discussion. I think that it is I appreciate the fact that he is trying to get at what is the heart of Christian belief, and he talks about the key message being Christ's dying and rising again. And as we dive into it a little bit more, you realize that it really isn't even the death and crucifixion that to him is the key message, the kerygma, but that it's the resurrection. And I think we can look at that and say, yes, thank you. It's pretty clear that for even someone like Bultmann, who is willing to jettison so much of the framework, that gospel message of resurrection is so important that he's trying to find a way to keep it. Maybe that in some ways ought to be a reminder to us as Christians not to lose sight of the resurrection as something special, something that we should always be focused on expressing to the world, and the message of salvation that comes from that. Perhaps what we can learn from Bultmann's desire to keep that, even if he ends up unmooring that message because of the loss of the framework, is for us to never lose sight that gospel message is so key. And there is a sense in which I think occasionally we more Orthodox Christians get accused, sometimes maybe with some justice, sometimes maybe not so much. We get accused of even losing that message of salvation in the framework of rules and regulations, and you must do this and you must not do that. Again, I would say that we don't want to lose that framework, because that includes is key for us to understand gospel. It's for us to remember that to Bultmann, it was so important not to lose that he was trying to find a way to preserve it, even if we don't agree that he did so. I think also I found some of his discussions on eschatology and how important eschatology was to him when it comes to, again, that kerygma of Christ rising again in salvation. It's interesting. It's perhaps, again, we wouldn't, in more the Orthodox Reformed world, we wouldn't buy into all of what Bultmann has done here. But there's at least some interesting discussion about what does it mean? What is eschatology? Is it really just about something that will happen in the by, or is there something about eschatology and that the triumph of Christ over the cross in his resurrection that plays for us in the here and now as well? And I think, again, as Christians, we can't lose that. And we see that Bultmann has tried to preserve that in some ways and has done some interesting things on that. But without the framework, he's not able to get to, I think, to a real good answer. But he's also perceptive enough to recognize that there are issues here that need to be dealt with. And so some of those other issues that get discussed, theology and salvation, even though in the end, I think we would evaluate Bultmann as missing the mark, there are some things there that make thinking about Bultmann and thinking about what he was trying to do something that would be very, very valuable as Christians, because there's something to be gained from it, even if we don't buy into that whole loss of framework.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you. We have in Bultmann perhaps one of the most clear exponents of the new modernism in Christianity. And at the risk of being crass, at the risk of oversimplifying, I think there's a strong pushback that Christians who are confessional in the old sense, the sense of Luther and Calvin, and the writers of the classic creeds and confessions. I think where we want to push back is on this idea that it seems as if the theology of the neo-Orthodox, so think here Bultmann, Karl Barth, Emil Brunner, many others, it seems as if these theologies develop as a response to the quote-unquote collapse of Christianity as an intellectual endeavor. And so we have, for example, Darwin's Origin of the Species that came out. I believe it burst onto the scene maybe 1865, if I'm remembering that date correctly, in Europe. And within 5 years, it was virtually unopposed by the church of that day. So the 19th century church folded like a cheap house of cards, if I may say quite pejoratively. And it became a fait accompli in the humanities, in the universities coming from the Jena school. It became a fait accompli that faith was not a tool that should be in the toolbox of the modern thinker, that it was a form of dead weight or a hindrance. And so this is where I get to the crass part. I find it very difficult to see Barth and Bultmann, Brunner, as well as others in the latter half of the 19th century. I find it very hard to find a positive opening or origin for neo-orthodoxy. It almost seems to this observer that it's a matter of, I can't go to the academy and hold my head up anymore. So I'm going to take the dialectical pivot associated with the challenges of 19th century secular thought. I'm going to run with the moderns. I'm going to take their football and I'm going to play on their team and I'm going to run toward the other goal, but I still want to be a Christian somehow. And so we see it starting and initiating in the theologies of people like Soren Kierkegaard, who were very harsh critics of the traditional orthodoxy. We see it then spilling over into the latter half of the 19th century, into the 20th century here. We see the alternative to this approach in the theologies of Abraham Kuyper and Herman Bavinck, who sided with the kleine Leuten, the little people, as you pointed out. And so risking the shame and the scorn of the sophisticated, cultured wine and cheese crowd in the academy, those folks stayed with the confessional heritage of Luther and Calvin. But we have Bultmann, we have Barth, we have Brunner, we have others who have said that there's a need to capitulate. Now, from this move comes what I would call a modern movement of Christian existentialism. And I would say that tracks very closely with the neo-orthodoxy movements. And so the modern Christian existentialist thinks that he's standing on a podium, looking down from a higher place at the people, the little people, the kleine Leuten, who are still ignorant enough to believe in what they would consider a literalistic or a wooden or a legalistic sense. And in that sense, Christian maturity from this existential perspective comes when a Christian, almost like a lizard, molts or sheds his skin, and he leaves behind those old literalistic ways, and he moves on to a more mature existential mode of thought, where existential here is going to ultimately be phenomenological, which we've talked about before, the turn to self, the inner light. But in this dialectical step, what seems so obvious is that the Bible ceases to be the Word of God for the Christian existentialist and becomes instead a subordinate standard to the individual, the existentialist's understanding of a rational, demythologized, modern understanding of the Bible. And so the Bible is really, to the modern, maybe not much more than reading the equivalent of something like Aesop's fables, or let's say the dramas of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. So read these as great literature and maybe find some truth and wisdom within them, but don't be foolish enough to take them as literally true, or as we who remain confessional looking back upon this might say, in the vein of orthodox. And that's a sharp criticism, Chuck. What are we going to do when the Academy says your views are outside of our Overton window? I think this is a very critical question for us today, as there are touched keystone issues in the culture wars where the traditional Christian position is simply unpalatable and unacceptable. Now, over and above the question of who died and made the secularists the arbiters of what's palatable and acceptable, what are we going to do with this as a culture? As Christians, how are we going to respond? And I think that's the challenge of modernity in a nutshell. And a big and deep and non superficial challenge it is. And yet, perhaps it's almost that simple. That was a pretty strong statement to make there, Chuck. How does it hit you?
I'm thinking about that. How do we deal with, you often use that term, the Overton window. How do we deal with this idea that Orthodox views may be outside of that? And I'm struck that in some ways, this chapter is written by Robert Knudsen, maybe provides us a little bit of an answer. I think Knudsen did a couple of things here that I found helpful. One is he doesn't pull back his punches. He is very critical in certain places, and he often uses not only his own words and his own discussion, but it seems that here, especially theologian Herman Ritterboss is one that in the evaluation section that has used often to point out where there are absolute problems. In fact, at one point, I think Knudsen describes it as an embarrassing problem for Bultmann, where he ends up. And so to pull no punches where there are clearly issues and problems with the particular views here. And Knudsen does that with Bultmann. Another piece is another thing that I think Knudsen does well is to point out, hey, look, we're not just going after this guy because we don't like him. In fact, there are things that we appreciate about him. And as I've mentioned as well, it does seem that what Knudsen does at least express some sympathy for what Bultmann is trying to do, while still pointing out the methods that he did so were problematic and allowed the problems of 19th century, the Vienna school, basically did not allow those problems to go away, that he was not enough of a radical break from it. He bought into too much of it, and in the end, his solutions didn't work, but at least gave an appreciation for why he may have expressed some concerns and for what he was trying to do. And I think that's the positive side of dialectical argument. Then, as I've pointed out, the negative side to it is when we allow the dialectical argument to, in essence, decide where the argument's going to go, and that we just decide that we're going to buy into at least a portion of what somebody is saying in order to synthesize two ideas. And I think it's fair to say that at times synthesizing two ideas doesn't work. If you're taking truth and falsehood and you try to synthesize them, what you're going to end up with is just another kind of falsehood. But the positive side to it is where we at least recognize where we might find some agreement with the person or the people with whom we're discussing, where we might find some appreciation for at least why they do what they're doing, even while we criticize the method they use to get there. So that's another thing that I think we can do is, even as we reject certain ways of thinking and certain views of things, and in that rejection, we may end up finding ourselves outside that Overton window. There is some value in at least expressing, okay, I see what you're trying to do here. I see the problem that you're trying to solve here, and I respect that. But now let's think about why the solutions you've had don't necessarily work. And yeah, I think in the end, that's what it does here, is a little bit of both. There's some appreciation for what Bultmann is trying to do and why he may be trying to do it, and yet where he very clearly has failed, there's no pulling of punches. There's no, okay, he tried. Trying is good enough. That's not what Knudsen does. And Knudsen very much points out the real weaknesses that result. As an example of that, I find towards the end of Knudsen's chapter, he just talks about how some of these issues of Bultmann's view on theology and his view on how faith and Christian event work together. Because even though Bultmann should accept the historicity of the resurrection of Christ and of other biblical miracles, they would, as contingent events, still have no cosmic significance. In other words, even if Bultmann would say, okay, fine, yeah, Christ did rise again. Oh, yeah, there were these biblical miracles, even though they seem strange to us moderns who really don't believe in such. In the end, Bultmann's way of thinking means that none of that makes any difference. They would have no significance for a present life of salvation. They would be swallowed up in the unrelatedness of the brute facts of history. And of course, what does that mean then? In the end, if all we can say is that Bultmann's ideas don't really, in the end, Christianity and these historical facts, the things of Scripture, don't really have any significant impact on our present life of salvation, then what's the purpose? For what purpose was Bultmann even trying to preserve this kerygma, this central idea of the gospel, if in the end it's really not significant? In the end, the framework that you've cut away leaves us nothing of any kind of importance to deal with. And I appreciated that kind of argument was made by Knudsen, because I think that's something that we as Christians can also, I think, in making our arguments, it's something that we can also use.
Thank you for that, Chuck. There is no doubt that we are in a predicament with Christian existentialist thought here. And it goes back to this idea that you talked about at the beginning of the session, this idea of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Now, it's what we haven't done in this episode, and we couldn't do it justice. I explicitly chose to not go into the specifics in great detail of form criticism, of what exactly does it mean to be myth, and what aspects of that approach might be reasonable or potentially valuable, and which aspects are not. And so I think that you and I need to still do that to successfully carry the day and put this villainous label onto Bultmann, to call him a theological stinker, as it were. And so I don't think that I've necessarily supported all that, but I think we've touched on some of the major issues. And in fact, we've left some of the major issues off. You mentioned, for example, the literalness of the resurrection. If we're proclaiming a method that maybe didn't happen in history and it doesn't matter, that's a really big hole in an approach to this demythologizing process. Also, this idea of supra-history versus history, very difficult. Did the events specified in the Bible actually happen or not? And in the order and to the degree that the text plainly testifies. This is or did things happen in some mythological space? Like these stories, the retelling of these stories represents some kernel or husk of something that happened in some meta history, whatever that means, versus actually occurring. And I almost think that this deserves its own sort of graduate level course to really go through and study what he has to say, where he wants to go with this, where we, standing on a different podium, looking over at him standing on his podium, might evaluate. And so I didn't want this evaluation to be just bulveristic, but I do want to push back on the Christian existentialists without meaning to just be looking for the big red button to kick people out of our club. I do want to push back and ask my existentialist friends, are you even a Christian? Now, again, I don't mean that in the crass sense, but I think about the warning from Christ, depart from me, I never knew you, and how that is going to come for so many persons who have this idea that they have, in fact, been born again, have accepted the Christ, when in fact they're not, they're deceived. And without trying to be ugly, and yet who can avoid it? If there's any flank in the Christian world, in Christendom, that seems to be exposed and in the air, I definitely am concerned for the existentialist movements. Now, that's not the final word, although that might be a final word for our discussion today. I think these folks still need more inquiry and investigation. We need to talk about them more, understand them better, go through things. But at the same point in time, if you're a lay person and you're looking for some improvement in your theological understanding, I'd be very suspect of recommending readings from Bultmann or one of the other existentialists. I think they fall into the dangerous side of the waters. So, Chuck, how would you wrap things up here with our discussion session with Bultmann? Have we done him justice? Is there more more to be considered in the movements than this? Were we perhaps overly reductionistic with him, or how did you try to piece it all together when you were putting it all into a big picture?
Of course, necessarily, when we talk about in 1 hour the multi-decade career of a theologian, we're going to be somewhat reductionistic. But I do think that, on the one hand, it is important to confront some of these issues and to point out where we believe that there have been some errors. Especially, one of the things that I appreciate about taking some time to look at these Orthodox folks, and I think we'll do that next week with a different thinker. But one of the reasons that I think is important to look at these folks specifically is that, again, as noted, it does seem like that at least some of their motivation for doing what they did is positive, right? They don't want to. They claim to not be throwing out the baby with the bathwater, and there's something to that. But of course, then just as we also, as modern Christians who live in this modern era, are going to want to contextualize the gospel message in a way that makes sense to people in our era, but we're also going to want to do it in a way that doesn't cause that framework to disappear, that doesn't, in essence, weaken the message so much that it becomes nothing. And so I think it is important then to look at where attempts at contextualization have gone much further than that and have become almost a acceptance of certain modern views that are opposed to Christianity. And so that even in our own attempts to do some contextualization, we don't fall into the same pitfalls as somebody like Bultmann does. And if we're really fair to ourselves and to somebody like Bultmann, it is entirely possible for us to do the same thing. We are also fallen people, and while we may think that we're doing a better job of sticking with the gospel truth, it's always possible for us to make an error like this. And so perhaps especially here, where on the one hand there's an attempt to not go so far as the Jena School and the 19th century liberals did, and to try to recover something from that, and yet to perhaps fail in that attempt because of being so too tied into the idols of our time, so to speak. I think it is a useful study to have, because it certainly causes us to think about how we do things as well.
So, my friend, we have another chance to move forward here, and thank you for that. I think next time we want to move our discussion over to one of Bultmann's colleagues, Karl Barth. And if we didn't do justice to Bultmann, there's even less of a chance of us doing justice to Barth. And yet, I think we can still speak profitably in one of our discussion sessions about some of these same issues and how they spill over. There's a similarity in thought and in some of the approaches and methods and ways of thinking, and even the choices that these two thinkers faced, that I think is valuable. So even though we came through one of the most difficult chapters, I think, in this book, in terms of talking about, again, if there's villain in this work, I would definitely have to put Bultmann in here. And yet I'm glad we spent the time talking it through and giving him as fair a shake as we could, and trying to consider what he had to say in as honest and responsible fashion as we could. So thank you for that, Chuck. And we'll see what kind of trouble we can get into in this same vein in the next week.
Sounds good. Sounds excellent.